Hey friends, this is Audie Cornish, host of CNN This Morning and The Assignment, and guess what? Every story you care about, every angle you want unpacked is now streaming on CNN. That means you can catch my show or other CNN programming whenever you want on your favorite device. And a subscription also gets you access to exclusive video series and unlimited articles. So subscribe to CNN at cnn.com/subscription.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Commercial Insurance. Business owners, meet Progressive Insurance. They make it easy to get discounts on commercial auto insurance and find coverages to grow with your business. Quote in as little as 8 minutes at progressivecommercial.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company. Coverage provided and serviced by affiliated and third-party insurers. Discounts and coverage selections not available in all states or situations.
Welcome back, True Crime Army. I am your host, Margot, and this is Military Murder, a show where I tell you true crime cases involving military members and veterans, all with one goal in mind, to remind you to remain vigilant always. Happy Veterans Day! Yes, happy Veterans Day to all my listeners who have served or are currently serving. I hope this week you don't forget to use your 10% Target discount, and don't forget to get your free meals. You really deserve it. And listen, groceries are expensive, okay? All right. As I sit on the sidelines watching all of my friends who still serve, I'm not going to lie, I feel a tiny bit of jealousy, as I sometimes wish I was still serving on active duty. But then I am immediately brought back to reality that those who serve sacrifice so much. So with that, my hat's off to you. And again, a giant thank you from me and my girlies. But I know you came here today for a case. And boy, do I have a case for you today. As we head into Veterans Day, I wanted to bring you a case about a veteran. The crime in today's case took place way back in January of 1976. That's almost 50 years ago. But this case didn't see its final resolution until the summer of 2025. It's a story that sounds like something out of a movie, but it's real. A kidnapping, a ransom, a murder, a police chase, a confession, and then after nearly 5 decades of legal ping pong, it all ended on a cold gurney inside a Mississippi prison. Join me today as I tell you the tragic story of Edwina Marter and the man who took her life, Richard Gerald Jordan. Now, let's dig in.
Military murder is an independent project and is not endorsed by the Department of Defense or any military component. The views expressed are those of the host. The content of this podcast is not meant to be legal or medical advice. Warning, this episode contains graphic details of murder and is not suitable for young listeners. Listener discretion is advised.
Our story today begins in Gulfport, Mississippi, and I'm taking you way back to 1976. It's a Monday, January 12th, 1976, and 35-year-old Edwina Marter is at home with her 3-year-old son. Her older son, who was either 10 or 11, depending on the report you read, is at a late afternoon catechism class, and Edwina's husband, Charles Marter, who goes by Chuck, is at work. He's a local bank executive. The Marters live in a quiet, safe community on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. Bad things just don't typically happen in this neighborhood. But that would soon change. As dusk approached, Edwina heard a knock at the door. She opened the door, and it was an electrician. He said he was there from the electric company and that he was making his rounds and needed to check the circuit breaker in her house due to some reported electrical issues. Edwina invited the man inside, but as soon as the door closed behind her, the alleged electrician pointed a gun at her and told her to follow his instructions or else. The man immediately forced Edwina to leave the house with him. Whether he knew her 3-year-old was in his bed sleeping, we don't know, but thankfully, the little boy was left uninjured. Sadly, though, his mother was kidnapped at gunpoint, and that little boy would never see his mother again. Edwina was forced into the driver's seat of the man's car, as the man directed Edwina to drive where he told her to. He kept the gun trained on her in case she made any sudden movements. Then, as they drove deep into the DeSoto National Forest, the towering pines began to block out the sky as darkness took over, and then the man ordered Edwina to stop and get out of the car. Now, what happened next is disputed, but here are the two versions of events. This is the first version. So the man orders Edwina to stop and get out of the car. Edwina realizes that this man is dangerous, and that's when she decides to take off. Seeing that Edwina was making a run for it, the man then aimed his .38 caliber pistol, attempted to fire a warning shot, but the shot hit Edwina in the back of the head and she died instantly. The second version of events is the following, and this is what investigators believe really happened. They believe that the kidnapper forced Edwina out of the car, down to the ground, either to her knees or to a crouching position, and then the man executed her. And that's the investigators' version of events, because an autopsy will later reveal that the bullet entered through the base of Edwina's skull and then traveled upward through the brain and exited above her left eye. What is certain is that Edwina's death was almost instant, and the man who killed her was a complete stranger to her and her family. You see, this man wasn't hired to kill Edwina. This wasn't a love triangle scenario. This was a complete stranger who had kidnapped Edwina for ransom, and this stranger's name was Richard Gerald Jordan. So, who is Richard Gerald Jordan? At the time he committed this crime, he was a 29-year-old Army veteran. Jordan was born and raised in Mississippi, and he had a pretty normal upbringing. He wasn't known to cause trouble in school, but it was after he left high school that he did find himself in a pickle. He got mixed up with check forgery, which is not a good thing, but in a twist that was not uncommon in that era, Jordan avoided prosecution by agreeing to join the Army. Now remember, this is the 1970s we're talking about here, and this was seen as a second chance for people, a way to get on the straight and narrow. Well, Jordan happened to join the Army at the height of the Vietnam War, and even though he served for 4 to 5 years, he ended up serving 3 back-to-back tours in Vietnam during that time period. Jordan would later point to his service in Vietnam and the atrocities that he witnessed as a mitigating factor for his later crime, but I'm going to talk to you more about that in a few minutes. After returning stateside, Jordan got in trouble with the military for falsifying official documents, and as a result, he was court-martialed and spent 9 months in military jail. Once he left the Army, he returned to Mississippi, he was married, had 3 kids, and he did odd jobs here and there. Then he moved to Louisiana, did odd jobs there, but by January of 1976, Jordan was unemployed. It was when he was unemployed that he got desperate and he came up with a plan. He had to get money and he had to get it fast. Bingo! He would need to kidnap someone whose family had a lot of money. Then he would demand ransom money. He'd then take that money and live happily ever after. I mean, I'm not sure how his brain thought it would all turn out, but it must have been something along those lines. Jordan's next step was finding and targeting a wealthy family. And since he didn't run in those types of circles, this man, no kidding, opened up a big yellow phone book from back in the day, and he turned to the pages that listed local banks. He called the Gulf National Bank in Gulfport and asked for the name of the person in charge of commercial loans. He was given the name Charles Marter. Jordan then looked up Charles Marter in the yellow pages, found Charles's home address, and decided Marter must be wealthy if he was a bank executive. And no kidding, that is how he picked his victim. Armed with Charles's name and home address, Richard Jordan traded in a shotgun for a .38 caliber pistol, and then he drove to Marter's home on January 12th to put his kidnapping plan in motion. Except for one little thing. We now know that Jordan killed Edwina before anyone even knew she was missing. So what did Jordan do after he killed Edwina? Did he run? Did he get anxious? Did he abort his plan? Well, none of the above. After killing Edwina, Jordan headed to a movie theater and watched a movie. The movie was called Death Wish, and it was a vigilante thriller about a man avenging his family, which honestly is an odd movie choice considering what he had just done. After the movie, Jordan locks in and continued on to the next phase of his plan, the ransom. Using a payphone, Jordan made contact with Edwina's husband, Charles. Jordan told Charles that he had kidnapped his wife, but not to worry because she was alive and unharmed. Then he demanded $25,000 in cash in exchange for returning Edwina. Now, $25,000 in 1976 is equivalent to $142,000, $145,000 today with inflation, so it's not chump change. Over the phone, they arrange a drop-off location, Jordan giving specific instructions on where to leave the cash. But guess what? By the time of the drop, local authorities and the FBI were already involved, and they were not letting Charles go alone. Charles, desperate to save his wife, made the drop. But Jordan, he was much smarter than his decisions. He had been watching from afar, and he was tipped off that authorities were waiting to ambush him. He was so spooked that he never went in for the money. Instead, the following day, Jordan called Charles and accused him of pulling a fast one on him, or attempting to. He was like, listen, let's try this again, but no cops for real this time. A new drop location was set, and Jordan gave very strict instructions. Jordan basically had Charles drive in a zigzag in and out of streets before jumping on the highway, likely to shake any type of tails that he could have had. Charles did as instructed, and he made the drop. Jordan watched and waited. Seeing nothing out of the ordinary after the drop, Jordan drove up, exited the car, and retrieved the cash. Just then, he spotted movement. It was authorities, and they were there to arrest him. But Jordan wasn't going down without a fight. Instead, clutching the money, he jumped back into his car, and a high-speed chase ensued. Now, I don't know about you, but the only high-speed chase I remember is the O.J. Simpson one. But when I was reading about this one, I was shocked. Not only was Jordan racing away from cops on the highway, this man used his vehicle as a weapon, ramming a sheriff's vehicle and forcing it into a ditch. It came to the point where shots were even fired by the police at Jordan's car in an attempt to get him to stop. But like a scene from a movie, Jordan managed to escape unharmed. As you can imagine, it was pure chaos. How could the cops let this guy get away? Well, Jordan evaded immediate capture, and seeing a clear coast, he abandoned his car in a shopping center. But before leaving the car, he took the ransom money, or as much as he could discreetly take. He made a beeline towards the woods, stashed most of the cash in the woods, only taking enough to tide him over. Then he headed into a store to buy a change of clothes. Jordan then quickly made a wardrobe change, which was not discreet at all, because he ended up buying a bright red jumpsuit, which, hello, they're going to see you a mile away. By the way, I did forget to mention this earlier, but after killing Edwina, Jordan ditched the gun in a river. And now, after his change of clothing, he ditched his own clothes, and then, as if nothing happened, he called a taxi cab. The taxi cab eventually arrives, and he later says, yeah, the guy I picked up was calm, cool, collected, like we were talking about the weather. Well, it was while Jordan was in this taxi that his luck had run out, because authorities had already put roadblocks and checkpoints into action. And just as Jordan thought he was in the clear, his taxi cab was stopped, and one of the officers at the checkpoint recognized Jordan. At 1 p.m., the day after he had kidnapped and killed Edwina, Richard Gerald Jordan was arrested without incident. Now, remember, at the point that Jordan was arrested, authorities and Edwina's family were hopeful that she was still alive. But their hopes were soon dashed. Jordan confessed almost immediately. Jordan even volunteered to take authorities to Edwina's body and to the murder weapon. True to his word, Jordan did exactly that. He took investigators to the DeSoto National Forest to where he left Edwina. He then told them he tossed his gun in the Big Biloxi River. Scuba divers would later recover Jordan's weapon in that exact river. Now, this is one of those investigations where the case was practically solved within 24 hours of it occurring. But this case, in reality, would become one of the longest legal sagas in Mississippi's history.
I am so excited for the spa day. Candles lit, music on, hot tub warm and ready. And then my chronic hives come back. Again, in the middle of my spa day. What a wet blanket. Looks like another spell of itchy red skin. If you have chronic spontaneous urticaria or CSU, there is a different treatment option. Hives during my next spa day? Not if I can help it. Learn more at treatmyhives.com.
Given Jordan's confession and the overwhelming evidence, the case against him was solid. Prosecutors charged him with capital murder because the killing happened during a kidnapping, which made him eligible for the death penalty. And at first, things moved fast. His trial started just 6 months later in July of 1976. Because the case got a ton of media attention, his defense requested a venue change. So instead of Harrison County, where Gulfport is located, the trial was moved to nearby Jackson County and held in Pascagoula. At that first trial, things were pretty straightforward. The prosecution laid out their case, calling 24 witnesses to walk the jury through what happened. The defense? They didn't call a single person to testify. Jordan had already confessed, so there wasn't much to dispute. The jury in that case deliberated for 4 hours before coming back with a guilty verdict on July 21, 1976. When the judge asked Jordan if he had anything to say before sentencing, Jordan declined. Now, here's where it gets complicated. At that time, Mississippi still had a law on the books that made the death penalty automatic for capital murder. So that meant that once Jordan was found guilty, the judge immediately sentenced him to death. No second hearing, no weighing of factors, nothing. You are going to die. But that same year, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that those kinds of automatic death sentences were unconstitutional. That meant Jordan's conviction and sentence were overturned on appeal. He'd need to be retried under a new 2-phase process, one phase to determine guilt and a second phase to decide punishment. So, in early 1977, Jordan went back to trial. Same charges, same location. And not surprisingly, he was found guilty again. But this time, the focus shifted to the sentencing phase, where the jury had to decide between death and life in prison. Jordan's defense fought hard this time. They brought in character witnesses, including Jordan's parents and a prison chaplain who had been counseling Jordan. One of his attorneys, Earl Denham, told the jury, quote, "Something happened to him around the age of 30. I'll never know what it is. He was and remains a sick man," end quote. It was a subtle reference to Jordan's mental state, possibly even PTSD from his time in Vietnam. But that wasn't something widely talked about back then. You know, PTSD in the 1970s, like, are you kidding me? People are like, no, that's not really a thing. Meanwhile, the prosecution at this sentencing hearing emphasized how calculated Jordan's crime was. They pointed to the fact that Jordan had planned the kidnapping, killed a completely innocent woman he didn't even know, and then gave her family false hope with those ransom calls. They also pointed to the fact that under Mississippi law, committing a murder during a kidnapping is actually an aggravating factor, and that alone made him eligible for the death penalty. Their argument was simple. This was a cold, cruel crime driven by greed, and it deserved the harshest punishment. During jury deliberations for the sentence, things got tense. At first, it didn't look like the jury would be able to reach a unanimous sentence. One juror was on the fence about giving him the death penalty, which led to a standoff in the jury room. Eventually, the lone holdout changed their mind, and by 7 p.m. on March 2nd, 1977, the jury returned a unanimous sentence: death. Richard Jordan was sentenced to die for the second time. You'd think that that would be the end of it, right? But Jordan's case was far from over. Over the next several years, Jordan's death sentence would be overturned again and again on legal grounds. One of the biggest issues came up in the early 80s. Jordan's team argued that the jury in his 1977 sentencing hadn't been properly instructed on how to weigh aggravating circumstances. The prosecutor had told jurors something very vague, like, quote, "Each of you has to decide what an aggravating factor is," end quote, which really isn't a specific definition under the law. And, well, in 1982, the Fifth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals agreed with Jordan's defense, and they ruled that jurors needed clear, objective standards. They then threw out the death sentence and ordered a new sentencing hearing. So this brings us to 1983. In 1983, Jordan went before yet another jury, this time just to determine whether he should die or live. By then, he'd been on death row for 7 years, and his attorneys pointed to his clean disciplinary record in prison. Jordan had been helping teach classes, counseling other inmates, and he was trying to contribute to society inside of the prison walls, despite being on death row. His defense also wanted to introduce evidence about his mental health, including the possible trauma from Vietnam. But the court wouldn't allow everything. Mississippi law at the time didn't let the defense present evidence about Jordan's ability to adapt to prison life, which could have been a powerful mitigating factor. Still, the jury, after they heard everything in sentencing, they sentenced Jordan to death. This would be his third death sentence. But that one didn't stick either. In later appeals, Jordan's team raised more concerns. One of those concerns was that the prosecution had acted vindictively by continuing to seek the death penalty after earlier sentences were overturned. I don't know why anybody would ever argue that, but whatever. They also pointed out that the court-appointed doctor in 1983 had barely evaluated Jordan and completely missed signs of PTSD. Jordan later argued that the evaluation was rushed and done by someone with no expertise in combat trauma. Well, in 1986, a court vacated the 1983 death sentence, largely due to concerns that Jordan hadn't been allowed to present all relevant mitigating evidence. And that claim of prosecutorial vindictiveness, well, Amnesty International noted that it was never fully heard on its merits, even decades later. By the late 1980s, Mississippi prosecutors were stuck. They'd convicted Richard Jordan 2 times, they'd secured 3 death sentences, and every single one had been overturned. From the state's perspective, Jordan was clearly guilty and he deserved the death penalty. But the case had become a legal marathon. So in 1991, the prosecutor tried a new approach. They struck a deal. Instead of putting the victim's family and Jordan through yet another death penalty phase, the prosecution and defense agreed that Jordan would serve life in prison without parole. In return, he'd drop all future appeals. It was a rare compromise, but it seemed pretty simple. The state even acknowledged Jordan's military service. They acknowledged his good behavior behind bars, and they acknowledged that he was actually remorseful. And guess what? With all of that, a judge signed off on it. And for a brief moment, it actually looked like this case was finally over. But that peace of mind didn't last long. There was one big problem here. Life without parole wasn't an option under Mississippi law in 1976 when the murder happened. Back then, the only legal sentences for capital murder were, get this, it was either death or life with the possibility of parole. What? That is so crazy to me. So technically, the 1991 sentence that they had agreed upon was illegal, and Jordan knew it. Despite agreeing to the deal, which he probably could have agreed to and gotten away with, well, despite agreeing to it, Jordan filed another appeal. This time, he was arguing that since his sentence wasn't valid, he should get the lesser sentence, which is life with parole instead. In other words, he went back on that agreement that had spared his life, and now he was hoping for an even better outcome. But the Mississippi Supreme Court wasn't having the shenanigans. They ruled that the 1991 deal was actually void from the start because it handed down a sentence not allowed by law. That meant the case was open again, and prosecutors were free to pursue the death penalty again. That's right. We were now going into a 4th sentencing hearing. So, in April of 1998, more than 2 decades after the murder, Jordan went through his 4th capital sentencing hearing. By then, he was in his early 50s, and guess what? Edwina Marter's family was still waiting for justice. Mind you, this man committed the crime when he was 29 years old, and now he's 50. Well, at this hearing, Jordan's defense tried to present new evidence, especially about his mental health and PTSD from his combat days in Vietnam. But their efforts didn't land. Jordan wasn't given an independent mental health expert, which he was legally entitled to. Instead, the judge appointed a state psychiatrist who did a brief evaluation and said Jordan didn't show any signs of PTSD. So the jury, again, never heard the full story of how combat trauma might have played a role in his crime. Chrissy Nobile, one of Jordan's later attorneys, said that if a proper expert had been appointed, the jury might have actually heard compelling evidence about Jordan's experience and the psychological damage he carried with him. She thought it could have made a big difference. but that didn't happen. And the result? Just like before, the jury sentenced Richard Jordan to death for the fourth time. This time, though, the sentence stuck. In 2001, the Mississippi Supreme Court upheld the sentence. The justices noted almost wearily that this was now the oldest and longest running death penalty case in the state's history. By that point, they'd reviewed Jordan's case 5 separate times. The Fifth Circuit had weighed in twice, and the United States Supreme Court had been involved 3 times. This time, Jordan had raised 34 claims of legal error. The judge denied them all. And with that, Jordan's direct appeal saga finally came to a close. But Jordan's legal battle didn't stop there. He filed more post-conviction petitions after post-conviction petitions. He was challenging the sentence on constitutional grounds. Now, can I just pause for a second and remind us all that this man literally got a get-out-of-jail-free card when he got LWOP, which is life without prison, but then he appealed that and then was sent back to death row. Okay, I know, I just wanted to remind you of that tidbit in case you forgot. Anyway, one of Jordan's key arguments was what's known as a lackey claim. That's based on a legal theory suggesting it's cruel and unusual punishment to execute someone after they've been on death row for decades. Oh my gosh, this is crazy. By the mid-2010s, you see, Jordan had been under a death sentence for nearly 40 years. His lawyers argued that the sheer length of time he spent waiting to die had become its own form of psychological torture. Jordan himself claimed he had suffered severe trauma from the constant uncertainty and anxiety. He argued that by this point, executing him served no purpose, not as a deterrent and not as retribution. His attorneys even pointed to U.S. Supreme Court justices like John Paul Stevens and Stephen Breyer, who had questioned whether delayed executions like Jordan's violated the Eighth Amendment. But the courts didn't bite. The Mississippi Supreme Court and other courts rejected the claim outright. They were like, "Yeah, crazy." They pointed out that Jordan himself was the reason for much of the delay, thanks to his many successful appeals and legal challenges. In one ruling, the court quoted Justice Clarence Thomas, who said the Constitution doesn't protect someone from a delayed execution caused by the panoply of appellate procedures they pursued. So as long as a conviction and sentence were valid, the passage of time alone wasn't enough to overturn a death sentence. Around the same time, Jordan joined another major legal effort, a lawsuit challenging Mississippi's legal injection protocol. Mississippi, like many states, used a 3-drug cocktail for executions. Jordan and other inmates argued that the process could cause extreme pain and was therefore unconstitutional. These lawsuits dragged on for years and effectively halted executions in Mississippi after 2012. In fact, from 2012 to late 2021, no executions were carried out in the state of Mississippi. During that period of non-executions, the state struggled to obtain legal injection drugs, and Jordan's own execution date was postponed multiple times. At one point, he was even the lead plaintiff in the federal case challenging the drugs. Eventually, Mississippi changed its laws to allow alternative execution methods if a legal injection became unavailable. And by late 2021, some of the legal obstacles had been cleared. But while Jordan was fighting in court, Edwina's family was still waiting. Year after year after year after year, they were waiting for justice. By the 2010s, Edwina's sons, Eric and Kevin, were grown men in their 50s. In interviews, they described the emotional toll of the endless delays. Eric was just 10, 11 years old when his mother was murdered. In an interview he gave, he said, quote, "I don't want him to get what he wants," end quote, meaning he didn't want Jordan to escape execution after everything the family had been through. To the Marters, every new legal delay felt like the system being gamed, and they were determined that after decades of waiting, the punishment would finally be carried out. As the years dragged on, Richard Gerald Jordan became known for being Mississippi's longest-serving death row inmate. By 2022, he spent nearly 46 years under a sentence of death, longer than anyone else in the state. At age 76, he was also Mississippi's oldest inmate on death row. But he didn't spend those 46 years idle. Now, let me be clear. Nothing I'm about to say is meant to excuse Jordan's actions. His crime was brutal and inexcusable. But I do think it's important to talk about what remorse can look like. Because if anything, this next part should be seen as a standard, not as a shield. I'm a firm believer in you do the crime, you pay the price. So with that said, over time, Jordan earned a reputation as an exemplary inmate. He taught Bible study and literacy classes, mentored other prisoners, and he was described as deeply remorseful. In his clemency petition, supporters called him a patriot, a Vietnam veteran, and a man of faith. Jordan often said that not a single day passed where he didn't think about Edwina, and he frequently prayed for her family's forgiveness. But remorse alone wasn't enough to stop the wheels of justice. In 2021, Mississippi resumed executions after nearly a decade-long break. And in October of 2024, the Attorney General's office formally asked the state Supreme Court to set an execution date for Richard Jordan. And the court agreed. In the spring of 2025, the court scheduled Jordan's execution for June 25, 2025, nearly half a century after Edwina's life was cut short. As the date approached, Jordan's legal team made one last punch. They asked the U.S. Supreme Court to step in, arguing that Jordan had never received a proper psychological evaluation at his 1998 hearing, despite being entitled to one. They presented new expert findings from 2002 showing that Jordan did in fact suffer from chronic PTSD, likely stemming from his 3 tours in Vietnam. No jury had ever heard that evidence. His lawyers continued to argue that if just one juror had understood that trauma, the outcome might have been different. At the same time, human rights groups rallied behind Jordan, not to excuse his crime, but to plead for mercy. Amnesty International pointed out that 3 of Jordan's death sentences had been overturned and that his PTSD had gone untreated for decades, noting even that the prosecutor from Jordan's 1991 plea deal had once supported a life sentence. Organizations like Death Penalty Action and the Catholic Mobilizing Network delivered petitions urging the governor to stop the execution, arguing that putting a now 79-year-old war veteran with PTSD to death served no real purpose. But the pleas didn't work. Governor Tate Reeves reviewed Jordan's clemency request, which included heartfelt letters from his wife, his sister, a pastor, and many others. But ultimately, the governor refused to intervene. He cited the heinous nature of the crime, Jordan's own confession, and the long legal process that had already affirmed the jury's sentence. And after the governor said no, the courts wouldn't intervene either. On June 24, 2025, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals denied Jordan's final motion for a stay. And just hours before the scheduled execution, the United States Supreme Court declined to hear his appeal. At that point, after 49 years on death row, every legal option had been exhausted. The state of Mississippi was now moving forward. Richard Gerald Jordan's case was finally about to reach its end. On June 25, 2025, at the Mississippi State Penitentiary in Parchman, the state prepared to carry out the execution of Richard Gerald Jordan. After nearly 49 years on death row for the kidnapping and murder of Edwina Marter, the execution chamber was readied for Mississippi's longest-serving condemned inmate. Outside the prison, small groups gathered, some holding vigil in protest of the death penalty, others praying for justice on behalf of the Marter family. Inside, Jordan had been moved to a holding cell days earlier. There, he said his final goodbyes to family, lawyers, and spiritual advisors. As per tradition, Jordan was allowed a final meal of his choosing. He asked for a simple comfort food menu: fried chicken tenders, French fries, strawberry ice cream, and a root beer float. It's a small detail, but it reminds us this man who committed an unspeakable crime was still, in the end, a human being. Jordan reportedly spent his final day calm and talkative, even sharing stories from his past with the prison superintendent who observed him. At 79 years old, after decades of uncertainty, it seemed he had finally made peace with what was coming. Witnesses were present on both sides. Jordan's wife, Marcia, whom he'd married while in prison, stood beside his attorney, Chrissy Nobile, and his spiritual advisor, Reverend Tim Murphy. Now, it is worth noting, just like a small side note, that until a 2022 Supreme Court ruling, Spiritual advisors weren't even allowed inside Mississippi's execution chamber, just FYI. On the other side of the fence, Edwina's immediate family, her sons Eric and Kevin, and her husband Chuck, well, they chose not to attend. After nearly 5 decades, maybe they just preferred to remember Edwina in life, not in death. Still, Edwina's brother and nephew were there to represent the family and witness the conclusion of a long and painful chapter. At 6:02 p.m., Jordan was led into the chamber and secured to the gurney. Mississippi used a 3-drug lethal injection protocol, but because of past lawsuits, including one that Jordan himself had led, the prison took extra care with the process. A sedative was administered first, and medical staff confirmed unconsciousness before proceeding with the other 2 drugs. Now, this extra step had been ordered by a federal judge to ensure a painless and humane execution. Before the drugs took full effect, Jordan was given the opportunity to speak. His voice was clear. Quote, "First, I would like to thank everyone for a humane way of doing this. I want to apologize to the victim's family," end quote. He then turned to his wife and lawyers, expressing his love and asking for forgiveness. And finally, he said, quote, "I will see you on the other side, all of you," end quote. And those were his last words. At 6:16 p.m., Richard Gerald Jordan was pronounced dead. He was 79 years old. His execution marked the end of the longest-running death penalty case in Mississippi history. Almost 50 years had passed since Edwina's life was stolen. Jordan's was only the 3rd execution in Mississippi in the past decade, underscoring just how rare and contentious this case had become. After the execution, a somber calm settled over those outside the prison. Keith DeGrew, Edwina's nephew, delivered a statement on behalf of the family. And here is that statement in full.
Hello, I'm just here to represent the family of Edwina Marter after this execution. My name is Keith DeGrew. We're here today to speak on behalf of represent the family of Edwina DeGrew Marter. This statement was written on behalf of Edwina's immediate family, Chuck, Eric, and Kevin, who are not here today. This is their statement. Nothing will bring back our mom, sister, aunt, or friend. Nothing can ever change what Jordan took from us 49 years ago. Jordan tried desperately to change his ruling so he can simply die in prison. We never had an option. He took Edwina's life, never thought about the many people who loved her and relied on her. He took her away from us, never thinking about us. Edwina knew she was more likely going to die when Jordan took her from her home. She had to suffer while he drug her around, but knew she probably wouldn't live through it. Why should he get to live in prison and die of natural causes? We feel that he should have to endure the suffering of knowing his death was only hours away, just like Edwina had to endure. It's very disappointing that it has taken 49 years to get some type of conclusion on their mother's death. She had 2 young sons whose lives would have been completely different to have a mother present. Her sons, now 59 and 52 years old, they still have lives they would love to share with Edwina and have her here to be a part of. They will never have that option. Jordan took from them, and he didn't deserve an option either. Although they may forgive him, it doesn't change what they missed for 49 years. On the rest of the family, this is a day of celebration for justice and a day for sadness for all involved. Jordan changed the lives of our family the day he took Edwina to murder her for money. His selfish actions affected so many. Our condolences to the Jordan family, as his selfish mistake has affected their lives as well. This man has been on death row for 49 years. Yet today is not about Jordan. It's about Edwina Marter and justice being served. Edwina had a life much like a lot of us here. She was a wife, mother, sister, aunt, and friend. She was loved and needed. Her story ended the day Jordan made the decision to take her life. Mary Agnes DeGrew, Roger DeGrew, Norma Wells are Edwina's siblings. Mary Agnes passed away. Waiting for this day, so did my mom, Florence DeGrew. They and the rest of our family missing her for 49 years. Jordan's service to this country, or any good he has done in prison, will never make up for the moment he pulled the trigger, killing Edwina Marter. This was thought out, planned out, and carried out. There was so much involved in this calculated, horrific, disgusting decision. He had many opportunities not to go through with this. We are grateful this day has finally come, even though it doesn't fill the void of Edwina being taken from our lives. She will forever be missed by her family and friends. Thank you for coming.
Mississippi's Attorney General also issued a public statement saying her office had fought for years to bring justice, not just for the Marter family, but for the community. She expressed hope that the execution would bring some measure of peace to those affected by the crime. But not everyone felt peace. Anti-death penalty advocates mourned the loss of what they saw as a changed man, a 79-year-old veteran who had shown remorse, rehabilitation, and humanity behind bars. They questioned whether carrying out the sentence after so long still served any real purpose. And maybe that's what makes this case so haunting. It's not just the story of a horrific crime. It's the story of 4 trials, 4 death sentences, and nearly 5 decades of legal battles. A case where both justice and mercy were pursued to the fullest extent, and where the system's slow march affected everyone involved. In the end, Richard Gerald Jordan's case stands as one of the most extraordinary in American criminal justice history. And while justice may have been delayed, it was at last delivered. I want to end by remembering Edwina Marter. Edwina Marter was born in New Orleans. Edwina grew up with 2 sisters and a brother, and she attended LSU in Baton Rouge. And it was there at LSU where she met her future husband, Charles. After college, Edwina and Charles moved to Mississippi, where Charles found a job working at the Gulf National Bank, and where they settled down to build their life as a family. This is where they welcomed their 2 sons and set down roots with hope and promise. As I reflect on this case, my heart goes out to the Marter family. They lost a wife, a mother, a sister, a woman whose life can never be returned. But perhaps now, almost 5 decades after her life was cut short, Edwina can finally rest in peace. True Crime Army, I'm not sure about you, but I had so many big feelings going into this case. Anger and disbelief, they swept over me as I thought about how trusting Edwina was. I felt terrified and outraged as I thought about her 2 young sons who never got to see their mother again. But then the other part of me, right? I felt humanity. Humanity swept over me as I considered the perpetrator and his undiagnosed PTSD. Y'all, I am still grappling with the different emotions, but my soul does rest in knowing that the case is finally over. And really, the legal part of my brain goes back to the fact that at one point in time, Jordan did receive a deal. He received life without parole, but he chose to appeal. So really, he made his bed when he killed Edwina, and he made his bed again when he appealed. So with that, I said what I said. If he truly was remorseful and asked for forgiveness and was a man of God, then maybe he's in a better place now. All right, True Crime Army, that was a heavy, heavy case. I just want to say thank you so much for supporting this show for 6 entire years. If you want to keep hearing episodes, make sure you leave a review. And if you want more episodes and you want to support the show even more, make sure you check out my Patreon at patreon.com/militarymurder. All right, everyone. My sources for this case included various appellate court opinions, various reports by AP News. I was also on newspapers.com, just looking up historical news reports from when this case occurred and all of the appeals. And also articles in Mississippi Today, Clarion, Ledger Archives, and USA Today. Military Murder is a Mama Margot production. The music was created by Tie-Ups. Until next time, remember, you never really know what someone is capable of, so remain vigilant always. You have a fabulous week, and I'll keep digging to bring you another military murder story next time.
Mama's working on her podcast. I don't want to.